That 1930s guy here from Soldier Field in Chicago, continuing my Chicago series here. And this video has absolutely nothing to do with football or sports, but this right here, this Roman pillar, it is actually a pillar from ancient Rome that was originally built in the time of Jesus and brought here to Chicago by the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini as a gift to the city for their gigantic 1933-1934 World's Fair, which was called the Century of Progress, because Chicago was founded in 1833, or incorporated officially in 1833, March 4th, 1833 to be specific. And so they decided to have this giant fair celebrating the great things that were to come in the future, even though they were in the middle of the Depression and it was a terrible time. But this fair still actually did pretty well, and it was definitely one of the big events of the 1930s. And this is the last remaining relic of that fair. There's nothing else from that fair that exists that still is here today in the spot where it was. Even though where I'm standing here and across to Northerly Island over there, which is not an island anymore, it's a peninsula, completely man-made, but this is where this fair took place, on both sides of this waterway here. And this was where we're standing now, where the Italian pavilion took place. And so Mussolini gave this, and it was actually in honor of a pilot named Balbo, who took a fleet of state-of-the-art Italian planes across the Atlantic to here. I believe actually they went around the world, but they stopped here. And this was a monument to him. There's an inscription on it, but you can't, it's faded over time. But it basically, says what he did, that this was a pillar of ancient Rome. And but the best part's at the end. It says that this is taking place in the 11th year of the fascist era, because they were very proud of this new governmental system that came out of Italy. And it's interesting that it's still here. A lot of people did want to take it down in World War II and afterward, because of the fascism, obviously. Not exactly the greatest thing in the world, but it's still here today. And there's so many interesting things about this World's Fair, especially the way that it ended. That's my favorite part, and I'm going to explain it in this video, and you'll want to see it. It's a great story of the 30s. These icy waters are part of an inlet which connected to Lake Michigan, separates Northern Island right here, and the mainland, which is over here. You see Soldier Field, city of Chicago, and it's an interesting park with an interesting history. Before I get into the details of World's Fair stuff, I'll just explain how Northern Island came to be. It was actually an idea they had in the early 20th century to build a series of parks just offshore from Chicago on man-made islands. And this was the main one they built. The project kind of fizzled out. And then in the 20s and 30s, they were pushing to build an airport here for a while. It eventually did become an airport after World War II, Meigs Field. But during the Depression, they didn't have the money to do it. They were trying really hard. The Chicago Tribune especially was, had a campaign to make this an airport. But anyway, it became a Meigs Field, which was an iconic airport for a long time. People were very upset when it was taken down by the mayor in a rather sinister fashion in 2003. The city wanted to get rid of it. The people didn't want to. So one night, the mayor snuck a construction crew in and dug 2 giant X's through the runway and blocked the taxiways so they couldn't use it again. And he cited the reason because it was a terrorist, possible terrorist threat. I mean, this is in the wake of September 11th and all that. So, you know, that was the end of that of the airport, and then now it's just a park. But it was only an island until the early 30s, because early 30s they had to connect. They built, you can see the distance here between the mainland and the island, so that they could have the fair surround this inlet here. It went from, you know, down just south of Soldier Field all the way around to here, with pavilions. They had an amusement park area. It was pretty neat. Here's the Northern Island Visitor Center, closed on the weekends, so it's not open today because today is a Saturday. But and it's also right on the front. It lets you know that it's also closed during Bears games. I guess maybe it's too crowded or something, but I thought it was interesting that they have that right on the front door entrance. It says closed during Bears games. But anyway. Yeah, here's the old control tower for the airport, and you're probably wondering, how did they afford to have a World's Fair during the Depression? 1933 was the first year of the fair. It was originally going to be the only year, but they decided to make it two because it actually turned into a profit and did pretty well. But anyway, a little windy, sorry. And it was completely privately funded. It was not, the city had nothing to do with it. They originally came up with the idea in the 20s, before the Depression started. They started raising money for it, and one of the first interesting things that happened was that the big loan that they took out to fund the main part of the fair was taken out October 28th, 1929, right before one of the many crashes that happened during that month. The biggest crash happened the next day on the 29th. So they were able to get this money just in time for the fair. And I think after that, the $10 million loan that they received that day, the rest, they were only able to raise $800,000 after that in the next few years because of the economic situation. So they got it just in time, or the fair would have never happened. Of course, one of the main reasons they picked Northern Island to have the Century of Progress Fair was for the spectacular views and landscapes that surround this island. The reason why they made it in the first place, really. I mean, you have Lake Michigan here, coast of northeastern Illinois, and then you come up here to Chicago, and you have the city, and you have the Adler Planetarium right there, which I believed opened in 1930, but I'm not sure about that. But there were many interesting firsts that happened here. A lot of what they did here, they copied later, or made similar attractions for the 1939 World's Fair in New York City. One of the big attractions was Sally Rand, the fan dancer. She would dance naked, just with two giant fans, but she was, with her talent, she was able to cover all the parts of her body that would have got her in trouble with these fans. But that was a big story coming out of the fair. But there's another one, a little more family-friendly one. It has to do with Walt Disney. One of the attractions they had here wanted to display the progress, the technological progress that has helped the American family over the last 50 years. And so they had the idea of building a stage with different sets of representing time periods and display how the technology has made life easier for people. And they, instead of having the stage revolve, they had the audience, where the audience was seated, revolve in a circle around the different stages. Now you probably know that is exactly what the Carousel of Progress does in Disney World. Originally it was, of course, in the 1964 World's Fair, but actually Disney, I mean, you can only come to the conclusion that he got the idea here. I don't know if he ever, denied or acknowledged that he got the idea here or not, but, today, Carousel of Progress, the way Disney tells it, it was all Walt's creation, but it really wasn't. He took the idea from this fair, for sure, which was interesting. But they didn't have the animatronics, of course, and they actually had real actors doing each scene. So it was a little bit different, but the same exact concept. And I'm going to tell another interesting story from the fair. There was a group of homeless individuals that got together and saw the opportunity that existed from this fair to panhandle or ask for money, and so they organized themselves in a very efficient manner. They would all, the beginning of the day, they would get together. They had an encampment right outside the fair in Grant Park, and they would all arrange to be in specific spots where they knew there was a lot of tourist traffic, and they would switch spots every day so they wouldn't get the same people asking the same person again. And they would pool their money at the end of the day and divide it in a communist fashion evenly, supposedly, among themselves. It was a big news story in Chicago at the time how efficient this group was, and they wouldn't just let anybody in. You couldn't just step in and say, "Oh, I'm going to be part of the group now." You had to sort of be initiated into this group. They only wanted people that were really willing to work panhandling every day, and wouldn't just run off with their own share of the money. And because certain days you'd make more money than other days, so they were able to figure out that if they just all pool together, they'll all make more money that way. So they ran this interesting operation, and it dissolved after the fair was over. But during those 2 years, the people that were in this group said they were able to make a very good living off doing this, because there were so many people, especially from the Northeast, that were here that had money. And it was another interesting facet of the fair that went on besides the actual programmed events. I'll conclude this video with a nice stroll down the famous beaches of Chicago. Well, maybe not famous, but it is rather interesting having a beach landscape like this in the middle of a continent. But then there's nothing really quite like these giant Great Lakes that sit in the middle of of North America. It is pretty impressive to see a lake this size. But anyway, one of the more interesting stories I think I mentioned earlier is how, rather disgracefully, on October 31st, Halloween 1934, the last day of the fair, no one's quite sure how it started, but somebody started just ripping things and taking valuable items, and it caught on, and soon it was just an all-out looting riot, and people just started tearing things down, grabbing whatever they could, and taking it with them. And you know, there was fires, and there was just all kinds of wreckage everywhere. It was a disaster. It was really disgraceful for the city. And yeah, they didn't leave much behind to be saved. It just turned into a loot. The police and they got the fire department trying to stop these people. It was just too many people doing too many crazy things. So they ripped apart the fair at the very end. So whatever plans they had to preserve items of the fair, sort of like they preserved some of the stuff in New York City of the '64 World's Fair, that was originally an idea they floated, but they couldn't do it after this riot. And I mean, the reason behind it is probably because, like I said, it was the Depression. People needed to get money any way they could, and they probably figured, hey, you know, we can grab what we want and we could sell it later and make some money off this. And so there's no evidence that it was necessarily planned in advance, but it could have been by a small group of people, because it started, no one really knows how it started, but it started very quickly and it caught on very quickly. And the whole place was torn down in a matter of hours. And that's how these interesting Century of Progress World's Fair, beacon of optimism in a very bleak time, took place here in Chicago. Very interesting city, and this was definitely one of the highlights of the 30s for this city. We had a lot of tragedies during this decade. I hope you enjoyed hearing these little stories about the Century of Progress and the city of Chicago, and if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe to the channel. I appreciate it. Thank you for watching.